Margie Bowes' career wasn't just dead, it was sacrificed. She was an Opry star, a rising talent and the perfect sacrifice, because the sacrifice was her husband, Kingmaker Doyle Wilburn. He had a cruel truth to prove, that the power to create a queen also included the power to destroy one, and he used his own wife to prove it. While Loretta and Dolly were being crowned, Margie was being buried alive. This wasn't a love story. This was the transcript of a sacrificial ritual. The transcript of that sacrificial ritual begins with the Kingmaker who performed it. His ambition, the power to both create a queen and the ruthlessness to destroy one, was not born in Nashville. It was forged in the absolute rock-bottom dead center of the Great Depression. Doyle Virgil Wilburn was born on July 7, 1930, in the heart of the Ozarks in Hardy, Arkansas. This was not a time or a place for dreams. This was the absolute rock-bottom dead center of the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl was raging, and the American economy had ceased to exist. He was the first of 5 children, with his brother Teddy born just a year later, in 1931. His family was not just poor, they were destitute. They were tenant farmers, which was a polite term for indentured servants. They worked land they didn't own for a share of a crop that often failed, and his father, a man forged in generations of Appalachian hardship, supplemented their meager, failing farm income by working in the local coal mines. This, right here, is the psychological engine of Doyle Wilburn's entire life, the coal mine. It wasn't just a hard life theme for a future country song. It was a daily, visceral, suffocating reality. As a boy, Doyle didn't just hear about the mines, he lived them. He was a laborer from the time he was a teenager tasked with helping his father. He breathed the dust. He felt the suffocating darkness. And, as his biography notes, he witnessed the accidents. Imagine being a child in a place where work meant watching men, your neighbors, your friends' fathers, go into the darkness in the morning and be carried out, broken, crippled, or dead in the afternoon. Imagine seeing the permanent black dust etched into the lines of your own father's hands, his face, his lungs, a slowly accumulating death sentence. He saw the powerlessness. He saw the complete, total, crushing lack of control. He saw the desperation of a life spent trading your health, your very breath, for a handful of company script. His father, like all fathers of that era, preached one gospel and one gospel only, the value of a stable job. He pushed his sons toward that life, toward the security of the mines. But for young Doyle, that stable job was not security. It was a tomb. That fear of the mines never left him. His manic, workaholic, type A drive wasn't mere ambition. It was born from that childhood terror of powerlessness. It was the neurotic, terrifying, white-knuckled fear of a man who knew in his bones what it felt like to have no control at all. And in that darkness, in that suffocating world of coal dust and poverty, there was only one pinprick of light: music. The Wilburn family, like so many Appalachian families, had a secret language. They sang. They sang gospel in the church, their voices finding a harmony that was a direct line to God. They sang the old songs on the porch, and they were good. It became clear very early that the 2 oldest brothers, Teddy and Doyle, had a special genetic gift. Doyle had the driving, energetic, charismatic lead vocal. His brother Teddy, born just a year later, possessed the smooth, perfect, effortless high harmony. They were a natural-born duo, a single voice in 2 bodies. Their younger siblings, Geraldine, Lester, and Leslie, filled out the sound. This was not a hobby. This was a ticket out. In 1937, their father, in a moment of desperate entrepreneurial hope, formed the Wilburn Children Family Act. Doyle was just 7 years old. Teddy was 6. This was not a cute local novelty act. They were almost instantly professionals. They had a polish and a power that was shocking for their age. They began singing at local fairs, at church socials, and their harmony, that pure genetic blood harmony, was electrifying. They were the talk of the state. And in 1940, the dream, in its most impossible form, came true. The family, on a hopeful, audacious whim, drove to Nashville. They managed to get an audition, not with a record label, but with the king of country music himself, Roy Acuff. Imagine the scene. A carload of poor, dusty kids from the Arkansas hills walking onto the sacred, empty stage of the Riemann Auditorium. They stand in front of the most powerful man in the genre, and they sing. Roy Acuff, a man who had heard it all, a man who knew authenticity when he saw it, was stunned. He hired them on the spot. Let's pause to absorb the magnitude of this. Doyle Wilburn, at 10 years old, is not just visiting the Ryman. He is not a fan in the audience. He is a paid performing regular member of the Grand Ole Opry. He had done it. He had escaped the mine. He had, at 10 years old, reached the absolute pinnacle of the country music world. And then, just 6 months later, the system, the law, ripped it all away. A representative from the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which at the time also handled child welfare and labor disputes, stepped in. The Opry was informed in no uncertain terms that employing children as full-time touring performers was a flagrant violation of child labor laws. They were fired. This right here is the second great trauma of Doyle Wilburn's life. His first and greatest triumph was snatched away by a rule, by a system he couldn't fight. This moment is critical. It didn't just delay his career, it did something far more damaging. It sent him back. It sent him back to Arkansas, back to the shadow of the mines, back to the stable job his father had always wanted, his father's "I told you so" hanging in the air. This humiliation, this taste of paradise followed by a forced bureaucratic exile, would instill in Doyle a lifelong, profound distrust of the system and a ferocious, burning desire to one day not just join the system, but to become the system. If he couldn't be a star on the Opry, one day he would own the stars who sang on it. The war came. The 1940s were a blur. The family was forced to move, chasing work, from Arkansas to Louisiana. The dream was deferred, not dead. The coal dust and the humiliation was still on his skin. By 1948, the children were gone. Doyle was 18, Teddy was 17. They were no longer cute kids. They were seasoned, professional veterans with a chip on their shoulder. They were done with the small-time fairs. They headed to Shreveport, Louisiana, the home of the Opry's biggest and most dangerous rival, the Louisiana Hayride. The Hayride was their college. This was the show that broadcast across the entire South, the cradle of the stars. This was the stage where Hank Williams had exploded. This was where a young Elvis Presley would soon get his start. For 3 solid years, from 1948 to 1951, the Wilburn brothers were regular featured performers. This is where they professionalized their act. This is where they shed their child act image. They weren't just singing gospel anymore. They were a full-service entertainment machine, covering their hero, Hank Williams, building their repertoire, and honing their famous, friendly, on-stage rivalry. Doyle, the energetic driving lead, and Teddy, the smooth, smiling, high-harmony man. They were becoming stars. And then once again, just as their momentum was at its peak, the system intervened. In the early 1950s, the Korean War erupted. Both Doyle and his brother Teddy were drafted into the United States Army. This was the third interruption. The third time an external, uncontrollable force had halted their career. They were stationed together in Tokyo, Japan. The outline notes no combat, but this was not a vacation. This was the Army. This was 2 years of their absolute prime stolen. This was the stress of separation, of irrelevance, of watching their hard-won career momentum bleed away on the other side of the world. For Doyle, the man who needed to be in control, this was a special kind of hell. He was once again just a number, taking orders. This experience, this fear of separation and lost time, would only amplify the workaholic obsession that was to come. He would, in his future life, work with a kind of manic, desperate energy, as if he was always trying to make up for the years the system had stolen from him. When they were finally discharged and returned to America in 1953, they were men in their early 20s, but they were, in professional terms, 15-year veterans. They were done with interruptions. They were done with prodigies. They were done with being children. They were ready to conquer. They didn't go back to the hayride. They went straight back to the place that had rejected them. They went back to the Grand Ole Opry. This time, there were no child labor laws. This time, they were decorated war veterans. And this time, they were one of the most polished, dynamic, and explosive harmony acts in the world. They were, of course, immediately rehired. They were finally home. And this time, they didn't just join the cast. They began to dominate it. They were instant superstars. They began touring with major stars of the day, such as Farron Young and Webb Pierce. They were no longer the child opening act. They were the featured act, the one that could steal the show. In 1954, they signed with Decca Records, the major label that would be their home for the next 2 decades. And they were so good, so respected, that their very first job was as the anonymous backup singers for Webb Pierce on his massive number 4 hit, Sparkling Brown Eyes. But they were not destined to be backup singers for long. In 1956, they released their first major hit as the Wilburn Brothers, Go Away With Me. It shot to number 6. In 1959, they did it again. Which One Is to Blame? It hit number 4. By 1960, Doyle Wilburn had won. He was 30 years old. He was a war veteran. He was the lead singer of one of the hottest duos in music. He was a powerful, wealthy, and permanent member of the Grand Ole Opry. He was a respected peer of men like Webb Pierce and Ernest Tubb. He had, through sheer white-knuckled will, escaped the coal mines of Hardy, Arkansas, and had become a Nashville star. He had his stable job, and he had built it himself. He was in total control. And it was now at this absolute peak of his young success, at this moment of total confidence, that he was given a piece of secret, cynical advice that would foreshadow the entire tragic arc of his life. The advice, as noted by Cackett in 2019, came from his superstar friend, Marty Robbins. Robbins, himself a man who struggled with the pressures of fame and family, allegedly pulled Doyle aside. He warned him man to man about the unique poisons of show business. He told him that a wife, a family, these things were a strain. They were a distraction. They were an anchor that could and would pull a man's career to the bottom. The advice was clear. Avoid marriage, stay free, put the career first. Doyle, the man with a relentless need to steer every detail, whose entire identity was built on work, the man who had seen his career derailed 3 separate times by outside forces. He took this advice to heart. He was a 30-year-old star. He felt he had mastered his fate, and he was now secretly convinced that a family was a threat to his survival. And it was right at this moment in 1960, as a 30-year-old successful, charismatic, and newly cynical star, that he walked into the wings of the Grand Ole Opry and met a 19-year-old girl who had just herself become the talk of the town. A girl with a raw, emotional voice, a brand new top 10 hit, and a fire that matched his own. Her name was Margie Bowes. He was 30 years old, a star, a powerhouse, and a man secretly, cynically, warned against the trap of marriage. She was 19, a fiery, authentic, and brilliant new star, the talk of the town. But before we can understand the collision, the marriage, and the tragic slow-motion disintegration of their careers, we must first understand the woman. We must understand the other Appalachian fire that forged her. Her battle was not against the physical darkness of a coal mine. It was against the psychological shame of an image. Her story is the story of a hillbilly and the lifelong brutal war she waged to turn that word from an insult into a crown. This is the story of Margie Bowes. Margie Marie Bowes was born on March 18th, 1941, in Roxborough, North Carolina. Like Doyle, she was born into the long, hard shadow of the Great Depression. She was the youngest child of a poor, working-class family. Her father, a man of the earth, worked on farms and in the steel mills. Her mother sang the old world ballads, the same songs of faith and hardship that had echoed through those hills for generations. And like Doyle, Margie was a laborer from the time she was a child. She helped on the farm. She knew the feel of dirt under her nails, the ache of a long day's work. But her psychological engine was not a fear of powerlessness like Doyle's. It was a deep, burning conflict of identity. In Doyle's world, the family sang together as a unit, a professional shield against the world. In Margie's world, she was a solo act. And she was, in a word, different. She was, as she would later be described, rough, not in her manners, but in her soul. Her voice wasn't the clean, polite, pretty soprano of the pop singers on the radio. It was a direct reflection of her life. It was a hillbilly voice, a powerful, emotional, unpolished instrument that carried the roughness of the farm, the deep feeling of her mother's gospel, and the unapologetic twang of the rural South. And the world, very quickly, taught her to be ashamed of it. This is her core trauma. As a schoolgirl in the 1950s, she was teased relentlessly for that very sound. She was the country girl. She was the hillbilly. Her love for the Grand Ole Opry, her natural God-given voice, was a source of ridicule among her peers. This creates a profound neurosis of identity. It's the same shame that haunted Don Everly for his accent. It teaches you that your most authentic self is something to be hidden, but this conflict was even deeper. It wasn't just her peers, it was her family. Her mother, the source of the music, was a devout woman who pushed the sacred, acceptable sounds of gospel. Her father, meanwhile, was a conservative man who, as the outline notes, pushed his daughter to be ladylike. Imagine the psychological trap. The rough country sound that came naturally to her was mocked by her peers as hillbilly. But the ladylike polish her father demanded felt like a costume. And the gospel sound her mother encouraged didn't capture the full, raw, secular pain she felt in the music. She was trapped between three conflicting identities: the hillbilly, the lady, the saint. This war, this hillbilly's burden, is what gave her voice its famous emotional edge. It was the sound of a woman who was simultaneously proud of her roots and ashamed of them. It was a voice that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to cry out in praise or cry out in pain. And her only escape, her only validation was a stage. In 1954, at the astonishing age of 13, she found it. She began singing on the radio, on WDVA, and performing on the Virginia Barn Dance, a popular television show in Danville, Virginia. She was also a regular on WRXO-AM in her hometown of Roxborough. This is the moment that saved her. This is the pivot. The hillbilly sound that got her ridiculed in the school hallway was now getting her applause on television. The roughness that her father tried to smooth out was the very thing the audience loved. This was not just a hobby, this was vindication. She was learning in real time that her most authentic, rough self was not a weakness. It was her weapon. She quickly became a local sensation, but she was still just a child. She was, as the outline notes, limited by school, by her age. She was a local celebrity, but she was trapped watching the real world of Nashville from a distance. But she was also, like Doyle, incredibly smart. She was not just a natural talent, she was a student of the craft, a self-taught master of emotional delivery. And she was, like Doyle, fiercely protective of her image. As her 2020 obituary would later hint, she was wary of the child star label. She had seen what had happened to the Wilburn children, who had been fired from the Opry. She was careful. She was building her craft in private, waiting for the moment she could debut not as a child prodigy, but as a fully formed woman. She even, as analysis suggests, hid some of her early TV appearances, building a mystique for her eventual adult career. She graduated high school, and in 1958, at the age of 17, she decided it was time. She set her sights on the biggest prize in town, the Pet Milk Talent Contest. This was not a small local competition. This was the American Idol of its day. It was a massive, nationally promoted contest held in Nashville. The grand prize was not a trophy. It was a career. It was a contract with Hickory Records, the powerful label run by the legendary Roy Acuff and Wesley Rose, and, most importantly, a guaranteed performing spot on the Grand Ole Opry. Imagine the scene. Margie Bowes, now 17, a girl who had been told her entire life that her sound was too rough, too hillbilly, and not ladylike, travels to the big city. She is surrounded by polished, pretty singers from all over the country, all doing their best to sound like the pop stars of the day. And Margie steps up to the microphone. She doesn't compromise. She doesn't smooth out her edges. She doesn't become the ladylike singer her father wanted. Instead, she opens her mouth and lets out the full, unadulterated, emotional Appalachian truth. She sings with the roughness of the farm, the soul of the gospel, and the heartbroken twang of the hillbilly. And she wins. She wins everything. In one single night, her entire life's conflict was resolved. The hillbilly's burden became her crowning glory. The roughness was not a flaw. It was her signature. The world, it turned out, didn't want another polite, ladylike singer. It was starving for something real. The rocket was lit. Unlike the Wilburn brothers, who had to fight for 15 years with multiple interruptions, Margie's rise was meteoric. In 1958, at 17, she is signed to Hickory Records. She makes her debut on the Grand Ole Opry, not as a guest, but as a full-fledged member. She releases her first singles, Won't You Come Back to Me, One Broken Heart, One Time Too Many. They're good. But then in 1959, Hickory gives her the song that will define her. It's a song called Poor Old Heartsick Me. The song was a smash. It was pure, unapologetic hillbilly heartbreak, and it shot to number 10 on the Billboard country charts. Let's be clear about what this means. In 1959, a teenage girl on her rookie single scoring a top 10 hit on her own was a massive, massive deal. This was long before Loretta, before Tammy, before Dolly. Margie Bowes was, in that moment, the it girl of country music. She was the hottest new female voice in town. She was a regular, not just on the Opry, but on the national television show Jubilee USA. She followed up her hit with My Lovin' Little Me, which hit number 15, and Make a Wish. By 1960, she was a 19-year-old sensation. She had a top 10 hit. She was a powerhouse vocalist. She was a member of the Opry. She was a television star. And she had done it all herself. And now we are back to that moment in 1960, the fateful collision. We have Doyle Wilburn, a 30-year-old veteran, the lead singer of the hottest duo in town. A man at the peak of his power, a man who has finally gained total control after a lifetime of fighting the system. A man who has been secretly warned by a superstar that marriage is a career killer. And we have Margie Bowes, a 19-year-old prodigy, the hottest new solo female star in town. A woman who has just in one glorious 12-month sprint won her own brutal war for identity and authenticity. The Kingmaker meets the star. The man who needs control meets the woman who has just won her independence. He sees her in the wings of the Opry. He invites her to be a guest on his and Teddy's touring show. It is a professional courtesy, a smart booking. But it is also, as history would prove, a tragedy in the making. The collision, when it happened, was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. In the wings of the Grand Ole Opry in 1960, Doyle Wilburn, the 30-year-old battle-hardened veteran, saw in Margie Bowes, the 19-year-old prodigy, something more than just a new star. He saw a force. She was not just a pretty girl singer. She was, like him, an Appalachian-forged survivor. She was a powerhouse vocalist, a member of the Opry, a top 10 hitmaker. She was, in that moment, perhaps the only woman in Nashville who was his equal in grit, talent, and raw ambition. And for Margie, Doyle Wilburn was the living embodiment of success. He was 11 years her senior. He was a war veteran. He was the charismatic, handsome lead singer of the most powerful harmony group in country music. He was stability. He was control. He was the man who had already achieved everything she was fighting for. The courtship was a whirlwind. It was a Nashville power brokerage, and it immediately and violently put Doyle Wilburn at war with himself. This was the man who, at 30, was at the absolute peak of his power. And this was the man who had just been given the secret, cynical, and career-defining advice from his superstar friend, Marty Robbins. Avoid marriage, stay free. Doyle, the man whose entire life was a neurotic, white-knuckled sprint away from the trap of the coal mine, the man who had seen his career derailed 3 times by outside forces, was now being told that a family was the ultimate trap, that love was a distraction, that a wife was, in the cold calculus of show business, a career killer. And now, here was this brilliant, fiery, independent woman challenging that new cynical gospel. He was faced with a choice, his ambition or his heart. On November 11th, 1961, at the Calvary Baptist Church in Nashville, Doyle Virgil Wilburn, in a rare act of romantic defiance, ignored the warning. He married Margie Marie Bowes. The Nashville press went wild. It was the wedding of the year. It was the power couple. It was the perfect storybook union of 2 of the Opry's biggest, brightest, and most beloved stars. They were poised to become the next George and Tammy, the next Conway and Loretta. And for a few brief golden years, they were the perfect picture. In 1962, their only daughter, Virgie, was born. They were, to the outside world, the flawless country music family. Their careers, now intertwined, continued to explode. Doyle, with his brother Teddy, was unstoppable. In 1962, they released Trouble's Back in Town. It was a massive, character-driven hit, shooting to number 5 on the charts. They were the undisputed kings of the Opry, their blend of brotherly harmony and folksy on-stage rivalry, making them the most in-demand act in the business. Margie, now Margie Bowes Wilburn, continued her own promising solo career. She was a major artist. She moved from Hickory to Mercury Records and then, in a seemingly perfect move to Decca Records, the same label as her husband. She was still a consistent hitmaker. Little Miss Belonged to No One hit the charts in 1961, Lonely Pillow in 1962. In 1963, Think It Over and Our Things both charted, with Our Things climbing to a respectable number 33. In 1964, she had a string of hits, Understand Your Gal, Overnight, and Big City. Their collaboration was a natural, electric, and inevitable. In a now famous television appearance on WSM-TV in 1962, Margie joined the Wilburn brothers for a blistering, show-stopping performance of Send Me the Pillow You Dream On. The audience saw it. The chemistry, the power, the potential, they had everything. A high-profile marriage, a beautiful new child, matching record contracts, and a steady stream of chart hits. But it was here, at this absolute peak of their shared success, that a small, almost invisible crack began to form. A divergence, a shift in power that would, over the next 8 years, completely define their relationship, destroy their marriage, and mysteriously and tragically vanish his wife's career. The shift began not with a song, but with a business decision. It was an idea Doyle had been nursing since 1957, born from his paranoid distrust of the system. He was not just a singer. He was the son of a coal miner who had been cheated his whole life. He would not be cheated. He would not just be a performer at the mercy of the labels. He would be the boss. In the late 1950s, he had founded Surefire Publishing. This was the foundation. In the early 1960s, he and Teddy doubled down. They launched the Wilhelm Agency, a full-service talent and booking agency. This is the moment. This is the pivot. Doyle Wilburn, the Opry star, was simultaneously and secretly becoming Doyle Wilburn, the mogul. He was no longer just an artist. He was now the system. He was the gatekeeper. He was the man who signed the checks. He was the one who could make or break a career. He had at last achieved the total absolute control that he had been neurotically chasing his entire life, and his timing was impeccable. In 1960, just before his marriage to Margie, Doyle Wilburn, the new agency owner, heard a demo record from an unknown housewife in Washington State. The voice was raw, thin, and unapologetically hillbilly. Her songs were blunt, honest, and filled with a kind of domestic rage and wit that no one else was writing. Her name was Loretta Lynn. Doyle Wilburn, the man who had grown up in the same Appalachian grit, heard something no other producer heard. He heard authenticity. He heard the truth. The Wilhelm Agency signed Loretta Lynn in 1960, and Doyle made a decision that would change the course of music history. He did not change her. He did not, as other producers would have, try to polish her, to smooth out her hillbilly edges, to make her sound more ladylike, the very thing Margie Bowes had been fighting her whole life. No, Doyle did the opposite. He weaponized her authenticity. He took that raw hillbilly sound and he amplified it. He made it her brand. And then, in 1963, Doyle Wilburn made his masterstroke. He realized the future wasn't just radio, it was television. The Wilburn Brothers show debuted in 1963. This was not a small-time local program. This was a massive, nationally syndicated, professionally produced television show. It would go on to run for 11 years and produce 354 episodes. It instantly made Doyle Wilburn one of the most powerful and most visible men in all of American media. He was an Opry star. He was a hit recording artist. He was a publishing mogul. He was an agency owner. And now he was a national television host. And he used this new, immense power with a cold, brilliant, and ruthless strategic genius. The Wilburn Brothers show was not just an entertainment program. It was a 30-minute infomercial for the Wilhelm Agency. And who was the permanent featured girl singer on that show? Who was the artist that Doyle Wilburn beamed into the living rooms of millions of Americans week after week after week? It was not his wife. It was his client, Loretta Lynn. Doyle Wilburn, the Kingmaker, had just found his new queen. He pushed her relentlessly. He championed her. He used his TV show, his publishing company, and his agency to force her down the throat of a resistant industry, and it worked spectacularly. Loretta Lynn, under Doyle's masterful, controlling guidance, became the biggest, most important, and most revolutionary female star in country music. And while all of this was happening, where was Margie Bowes? She was at home. This is the central, devastating, unspoken tragedy of their story. In 1962, Margie gave birth to their daughter, Virgie, and almost immediately her career, that fiery, independent, top 10 launching rocket, was quietly and systematically grounded. Her solo career was allowed to continue, but as a shadow of its former self. Look at the charts. Her hits, which had been top 10 and top 15 before her marriage, were now fading. Understand Your Gal, Big City. After 1964, her name vanished from the top 40. She was not, however, invisible. She was, in fact, on television all the time. She was a frequent, beloved guest star on the Wilburn Brothers show. The psychological torment of this dynamic is staggering. Imagine Margie Bowes, a woman with a number 10 hit, a woman who had won the Opry crown on her own, now being forced to smile and sing on her husband's television show as a guest. She would sit on a hay bale, sing her song, and then watch from the wings as her husband put his arm around another woman, Loretta, and presented her to the world as the new, true voice of female country music. She was watching her husband give another woman the career that she was supposed to have. This was not a coincidence. This was not bad luck. This was, in all likelihood, a choice. Doyle Wilburn, the man now haunted by a terror of losing the reins, the man haunted by the ghost of the coal mine, the man secretly terrified by Marty Robbins's warning, had made a decision. He could not or would not allow his wife to be his competitor. A wife who was also a superstar was a threat. She was another outside force he could not control. Her independence, her hillbilly fire, the very things that had attracted him to her were now a liability to his empire. An employee, however, a client like Loretta Lynn, her he could control. He could mold her. He could manage her. Her success was his success. Doyle, the Kingmaker, had room for only one queen in his kingdom, and he had chosen Loretta. Margie was relegated to the one role he could control, the wife, the mother, the former star. She was trapped. She was on his record label, Decca, where she had to fight for scraps of promotion. She was in his home, raising his child. She was, in the end, just another asset in the Wilhelm agency, and a depreciating one at that. And as if to twist the knife when Loretta Lynn became too big, too powerful, and too independent for even Doyle to control, he simply created another one. In the late 1960s, he signed a young, bubbly, spectacularly talented songwriter from East Tennessee. Her name was Dolly Parton, and the cycle began all over again. Dolly became the new featured female on the Wilburn Brothers show. Doyle, the Kingmaker, now had a new queen in training. Margie Bowes was now not even the first other woman. She was an afterthought. Her career was, as one of her final heartbreaking 1968 song titles suggested, simply Gatherin' Dust. The marriage, which had begun as a power couple's fantasy, was now a hollow shell. It was a business arrangement, held together by a child and a shared address. Doyle's pathological workaholism, his constant touring, and his obsessive focus on his other female stars had left the marriage emotionally bankrupt. The touring strain was immense. He was never home, and when he was the kingmaker, the boss, a man who, according to all analysis, needed total suffocating control. In 1969, Margie released a single titled "I Have What It Takes." It sounds, in retrospect, like a desperate, defiant plea, a reminder to her husband, to the label, to the world, that she was still Margie Bowes, that she still had that top 10 fire. No one was listening. In 1970, she released The Note, and in 1971, The Note became a set of divorce papers. After 10 years, the golden marriage was over. It had not died of natural causes. It had been sacrificed systematically on the altar of the Kingmaker's ambition. The divorce, when it came in 1971, was not a peaceful separation. It was, as all historical records state, acrimonious. It was a bitter, painful, and public severing of a bond that had been rotting from the inside for a decade. The reasons, now clear, were the very foundations of their personalities. Doyle's workaholic obsession with dominance over his agency and his wife, and the relentless, crushing strain of his constant touring. The Kingmaker's empire had finally and officially claimed his marriage as its price, and the consequences for both were immediate, profound, and utterly divergent. For Doyle Wilburn, in the cold, hard world of business, the divorce was a footnote. It was a messy personal problem, but it did not slow the machine. His television show was still at its peak. Loretta and Dolly were regulars, solidifying their status as the biggest female stars on the planet. His publishing company, Surefire, was a goldmine, churning out hits. He was, by every measure, the winner. He had his empire. He had his control. He had, at last, shed the career-killing distraction that Marty Robbins had warned him about. He even continued to be the kingmaker. From 1973 to 1975, he took a young, unknown singer named Patty Loveless on the road with his tour on weekends. He was already scouting his next generation of stars. His life, his work, his relentless, forward-moving obsession did not pause for a single beat. He was the man who had outrun the coal mine, and he could not stop running. But for Margie Bowes, the divorce was not a footnote. It was an apocalypse. She was 30 years old. She was a single mother, and she was the ex-wife of one of the most powerful and perhaps most feared men in Nashville. The effect was immediate. Her career didn't just stall, it died. She signed with the Independent Stop Records in the early 1970s, a desperate attempt to find a home. But the singles, now disconnected from the Decca machine and the powerful Wilburn television platform, flopped. She was, in effect, blacklisted. Not officially, perhaps. Not in a way anyone would admit, but she was radioactive. Who would sign her? Who would promote her? Who would risk the professional wrath of Doyle Wilburn, the man who controlled the biggest TV show, the biggest booking agency, and the careers of the biggest stars? The industry, which had once celebrated her as its 19-year-old prodigy, now turned its back. The psychological toll was devastating. As her 2020 obituary would later confirm, she fell into a deep, temporary depression. She had lost everything, all at once. Her husband, her family structure, and the one thing that had been her salvation since she was 13 years old, her career. The girl who had been ridiculed as a hillbilly had fought her way to the top, only to be thrown from the summit by the very man who was supposed to be her partner. And her daughter, Virgie, was caught in the middle. As family obituaries would later note, Virgie was a private person who bore the divorce trauma in silence, a quiet casualty in her parents' high-stakes war. So Margie, the ultimate Appalachian survivor, did the only thing she could. She performed the greatest disappearing act in country music history. She did not fade away. She vanished. She turned her back on the industry that had turned its back on her. She went back to school. And in an act of profound quiet dignity and staggering resilience, she entered the medical field. This was not a side gig. This was a new life. The woman who had been a headlining star on the Grand Ole Opry, the woman who had sung for millions on television, was now in her 30s, working in a hospital, finding a new, more tangible, and perhaps more honest way to help people. As later analysis would suggest, this escape into the medical field was her lifeline. It was her way of battling the depression, of finding a new identity, a new purpose, a new stable job that had nothing to do with the fickle, cruel, and dishonest world of show business. For the next 2 decades, Margie Bowes, the top 10 star, was gone. She was just Margie, a working woman, a mother, a ghost in the halls of Nashville. While Margie was building her new, quiet life in obscurity, Doyle Wilburn was still running. His television show, The Mighty Wilburn Brothers Show, finally ended its 11-year run in 1974. The musical tides had changed. The outlaw movement had made his polished hay bale and gingham dress format feel dated. His brother Teddy, with the show now over, launched his own solo career. But Doyle remained the mogul, the head of the publishing empire, and then the one ghost he could never outrun, the ghost of the coal mine, the ghost of his own mortality, finally caught up with him. Doyle Wilburn, the man who had spent his entire life in a manic workaholic sprint, the man who had smoked relentlessly through decades of stress, touring, and business deals, was diagnosed with lung cancer. The irony is almost too cruel to be real. He had escaped the miner's black lung that had haunted his childhood, only to be struck down by a different, but just as deadly, disease of the lungs. The man whose entire life was about control was now facing the one uncontrollable internal betrayal. He fought it, but the cancer was as relentless as he was. On October 16, 1982, Doyle Wilburn died in Nashville. He was only 52 years old. He was buried in the Nashville National Cemetery, a final salute to his service as a veteran. The Kingmaker was dead. His empire, his legacy was now cemented. 354 episodes of television, and the careers of the 2 most important women in the history of country music. And Margie, then 41 years old, working in the medical field, read the news of her ex-husband's death. A final complicated chapter of her life had closed. She had survived him. She had, in her own quiet way, won. She continued her life, a silent living legend. She was a member of the Opry who never performed, a star who had chosen obscurity. She had found, it seemed, a fragile peace. And then in 1995, fate, in its infinite cruelty, decided to deal her one last devastating blow. Margie Bowes, now 54 years old, was in a severe, life-altering car accident. She did not die. She survived, but she was once again broken. Her foot and leg were shattered. The injuries were grievous, requiring multiple complex surgeries. The accident left her with a new, constant companion, chronic pain. Her mobility for the rest of her life was severely limited. It was a tragedy that echoes the story of Jan Howard. It was a random, senseless, violent act that defined the entire final chapter of her life. And as later analysis would reveal, the accident triggered her old demons. The depression, which she had fought and beaten after her divorce, returned. She was now in her mind a washed-up star, not just forgotten by the industry, but physically crippled. Isolated by her own pain, the fiery 19-year-old prodigy who had conquered Nashville was now a 54-year-old woman alone in constant pain and fighting once again the hillbilly's burden, the fear of being seen as a victim, as a tragic, broken figure. The last 2 decades of Margie Bowes' life were a testament to her quiet, Appalachian resilience. She lived with her chronic pain largely out of the public eye. But as the 2000s dawned, a new generation of music fans began to rediscover her. Her old classic recordings from the 50s and 60s were reissued. The internet buzzed with a new appreciation for her raw, authentic, pre-Loretta hillbilly sound. She was no longer Doyle Wilburn's ex-wife. She was Margie Bowes, a pioneer. She was invited to make occasional guest appearances, sometimes at Dollywood, a guest of the very woman her husband had once chosen over her. She was, in these final years, finally being recognized for her own legacy, not as a kingmaker's wife, but as one of the original classic queens of country. But the body, which had endured so much, was failing. Her health, compromised by the lifelong complications from the 1995 accident, began a long, slow decline. On October 22, 2020, in Brentwood, Tennessee, Margie Marie Bowes died from an extended illness. She was 79 years old. The fiery, rough voice from North Carolina was silent. The autopsy of their lives is complex, but it is also crystal clear. Doyle Wilburn's legacy is monumental. He was a television pioneer whose 354 episodes provided the single greatest platform for country music in its history. He was the kingmaker, the man whose obsessive, controlling genius built the careers of Loretta, Lynn, and Dolly Parton. But he was also a man so defined by the shadow of that mind, so terrified of losing control, that he sacrificed his own marriage and his own wife's career to his ambition. And Margie Bowes' legacy is one of the great, tragic what-ifs of country music. She was a pioneer of the hillbilly vocal, a top 10 star before Loretta, a powerful, authentic voice that was silenced not by a lack of talent, but by a controlling husband and a sexist industry. Their story is the ultimate bi-tragedy of a Nashville marriage. It's a story of what happens when one partner's ambition becomes an empire, and the other partner becomes a casualty. He was the kingmaker, but he was also the man who, in his obsessive quest for control, broke his own queen.